Hello. Can you hear me? Good evening. Good evening. Thank you so much for braving not only the heat but the thunderstorm to be here. I'm so happy that you're here with us. And if I did not see you yesterday, happy Juneteenth. I'm delighted to welcome you. Thank you. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Carnegie Library Lecture Hall for our first mid-local event of the season with our own Liann, Tsoukas and Ruck, authors of the biography of Pittsburgh's own legend and Network News' first African-American correspondent, Goode, reporting the life and work of a Black podcast trailblazer. Let's hear from Goode. My name is Sonny Toneme, and I serve as Executive Director of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures. On behalf of the board and our staff, again, welcome. Mid-Local, where we celebrate our own authors and stories, is presented in partnership with the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh and whose beautiful home we are in this evening. We also thank the Regional Asset District, RAD, the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts for their continued support. We thank our event collaborator, the University of Pittsburgh Press, the publisher of this beautiful book, and our promotional supporters, the Pittsburgh Black Media Federation and Point Park University Center for Media Innovation. Our friends from White Whale Bookstore are here with signed copies of books for sale. After the program, both Ruck and Liann are happy to personalize your books. If you would like your book personalized, we ask that you start the line right here in front of the banner and then wind it through the hallway. If you would still need to buy your book, you can start a line right here in front of the table, and once you get your book, we ask that you join the end of the line to join us. Tonight's program will be a conversation between the authors and the legendary journalist Edwina Kaikai, followed by an audience Q&A. Our colleague Caitlin Leisure will be passing a microphone during the Q&A. In order to make sure that everyone has a chance to participate and ask the questions, we ask that you keep your questions short and precise. We also ask that you silence your phone during the event and refrain from using flash photography. A reminder that subscription for the next season of 10 evenings is now open. You can purchase the whole series or select your favorite 5 lectures now. Single tickets will be available on July 15. And to buy your tickets or your subscriptions, you can go to pittsburghlectures.org. This concludes our announcements this evening. To introduce our guest tonight is John Fagan. John is the Marketing and Sales Director of the University of Pittsburgh Press. A native Pittsburgher, John started in publishing as a bookseller at the University of Pittsburgh Book Center. After graduating from Pitt, he moved on to a variety of sales and marketing positions at both Wyndham House and Penguin Books before returning home to Pittsburgh to join the press in 2018. Please help me give a warm welcome to John Fagan.
Good evening. Thanks so much for coming out on this hot day. As Sony said, I'm John Fagan with the University of Pittsburgh Press. And our mission at the Press is to publish a wide variety of books, from award-winning poetry and scholarly monographs in a range of subjects, as well as smart, well-written books of regional interest. Goode reporting, The Life and Work of a Black Broadcast Trailblazer, is a biography that illuminates not only Mal Goode's remarkable life, but illuminates our regional history as well as how it fits into the broader American story. Tonight it gives me great pleasure to introduce the authors of Mal Goode Reporting, Liann Tsoukas and Ruck. Liann Tsoukas teaches history at the University of Pittsburgh, where her courses focus on African American history, U.S. surveys, contemporary U.S. history, gender, and sport. Her work has been recognized with several honors, including recently the 2023 Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award. Ruck is a historian at the University of Pittsburgh, where he teaches and writes about sport as well as Pittsburgh history. He's the author of several books on football and baseball, and the recently published Pittsburgh Rising, co-authored with Ted Muller. Liann and Rob will be in discussion tonight with Edwina Kaikai, a trailblazer in journalism in her own right, as the first Black woman to become a senior editor at the Pittsburgh Press and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and later assistant managing editor, making her the first African-American woman to oversee the features department. Mrs. Kaikai also worked at Jet Magazine and is the recipient of many journalism awards, including the Pittsburgh Press Club of Western Pennsylvania's Golden Quill Award and a Pioneer Award from the Pittsburgh Black Media Federation, where she was also co-founder and co-director of the Pittsburgh Black Media Federation's Frank Bolden Urban Journalist Workshop for high school students. She's also the former president of the Pennsylvania Society of Newspaper Editors. The subject of tonight's discussion is, of course, Mal Goode, who became Network News' first African-American correspondent when ABC News hired him in 1962. Born in Virginia, raised in Homestead and Pittsburgh, he worked in the mills, graduated from Pitt, and went on to become a journalist for the Pittsburgh Courier, and he also did local radio. In those roles, Goode challenged the police, politicians, and segregation while providing Black listeners with a voice that captured their experience. Race prevented him from breaking into television until the great Jackie Robinson himself dared ABC to give Goode a chance. Goode was uncompromising in his belief that network news needed Black voices and perspectives if it were to authentically reflect the nation's complexities. His success at ABC initiated the slow integration of network news, and Goode's life and work are remarkably in their own right, but his struggles and achievements also speak to larger issues of American life and the African American experience. And before we go on, I'd like to thank Sony again and everyone at Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures, as well as the Pittsburgh Black Media Foundation, for partnering with us to make this Made Local presentation possible. And now, Liann Tsoukas, Ruck, and Edwina Kaikai.
Sit on the mic. Good evening. Okay, let me get situated here. I'm using technology. I printed out my questions, but I'm using my iPad to read from. I'm trying. First, let me just tell all of you that this is a fascinating book. It's, if you haven't read it, you're gonna wanna read it. And I hope you'll wanna read it even more based on the questions that I ask them and their answers. But as a native Pittsburgher and a retired newspaper editor, recovering journalist, I like to say, I knew the name Mal Goode, but I did not know the man. I did not know his story. I was a preteen when he started at ABC in 1962, becoming, as was said, the first African-American television network news correspondent. And although my parents always had the news on after dinner, it was on CBS. We never changed it out. So I didn't know anything about Mal Goode. But now, because of this book, I feel I not only know about his career, but also about the man. Because this book is more than his career and the man, it is a look at the social and political realities of America and Pittsburgh in which his life happened. Pittsburghers, especially Black Pittsburghers, will recognize many of the family names in the book: Lavelle, Brown, Posey, Utterback, Greenlee. And as you write in the book, he was born in 1908, the dawn of the 20th century, and he died in 1995, the dawn of the 21st century. And you all go back into the history of his family, not just his parents, but his grandparents. And you look at his life through the lens of the history that shaped them, from slavery to Reconstruction and the Jim Crow backlash to that, to the Great Migration from the South to places like Pittsburgh, and Black people's fight for equal rights long before there was an official civil rights movement and long before Mel Goode entered into media. I'm kind of gushing because
We'll take it.
because I was like, I kept reading and I would turn to my husband and say, "Did you know this? Can you imagine this?" And he's like, I said, "You have to read this book." So enough of my gushing. I'm going to start with my questions. And the first one is, what made you want to write a book about Mal Goode?
The first contact either of us had with the Goode family was in the 1980s, when I was doing a session on the Great Migration at the Western Pennsylvania Historical Society. I was talking about the Negro Leagues and Sandlot baseball. And afterwards, Mal Goode's son, Ronald, came up to me and gave me one of his father's bright red business cards and said, "If you want to know about the Homestead Grays and the Pittsburgh Crawfords, talk to him." Years later, I did a documentary on the Negro Leagues, and I talked to him, and he was amazing. I mean, it was a 3-hour interview, and it was about much more than baseball. An astounding personal and familial history. A couple of years later, 2 of his children came and said, "Would you write a story?" And I said, "As long as Liann's part of the deal."
Great. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, maybe it's because both of you are kind of history professors. There's a lot of history in here. I was expecting to find out about Mal Goode's life and his journalism career. But before you even get to that, there's history. Civil War, the end of the Civil War, like I said, Reconstruction, Jim Crow. And you go into such detail about that. Why did you find it necessary to go into that much detail about those periods of history before getting to Mal Goode's story?
We felt that this Mal Goode's life cuts a broad swath. It's an American story. It takes us through centuries of this complicated nation's history. And we found that every step along the way, the context was so rich and important to understanding the family's responses, reactions, decisions, movements, that without doing that, you had a very thin analysis of the Goodes and the Lavelles. And we wanted to be certain, since we did have the skill set to do that tedious research, to know where to go and how to kick it up and what to find and where to search, we wanted to provide that because we were able to.
Wow.
And we thought that made the story have far more significance as an American story and not just the story of Mal Goode and the Goode family.
Well, you hit it out of the ballpark, let me just say, to use a baseball analogy. There was the way you describe him, there was a grit and a strength of character in Mal Goode. And it seemed to have been fostered by his father and an admonition that he gave his son. Would you like to share that with the audience?
Do you remember the quote?
You're no better than anybody else, and nobody is better than you. Now go out and prove it.
Yep.
Am I right, Goods? Mm-hmm.
Mal's toughness and grit came every bit as much from his mother as it did from his father. I mean, his father had about 8 days of primary school, but the demands of the farm prevented him from getting any more. And he was illiterate when he came to Pittsburgh and started working in the Homestead mills. Mal's mother, from a different part of Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, had gotten an education, had done some teaching down there, and I think part of the prenups was that William Goode would learn how to read and write, and that every child would go to college. And she was the kind of woman who would go into a classroom and talk to teachers and confront them about things. So I think they got it from both father and mother.
Yeah, it was clear that that was a guiding force. His father's words. We all have a parent or somebody's voice in the back of our head when we're doing things, and I could see how that was his, in fact. But he also had 3 loves. You talk about his 3 loves. What were those?
Well, Mary Goode, Mary Lavelle Goode, his wife, the NAACP, and the Alphas, his fraternity. But I think Mary Goode said that all the time, too, to him. I don't think he said it. So she noted all the time that his loyalties and his adoration was divided among many forces. And she learned to live with was a very busy man.
Yes, 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 yes. Well, I'm going to call him Mr. Goode because, out of respect. His life was one of advocacy and social justice for black people, like I said, long before there was a civil rights movement, an official civil rights movement, and before he got to ABC. What's a favorite story of yours about his Pittsburgh advocacy?
You do that.
It's hard to pick among.
I know it is.
He fought about everything. Mm-hmm. If he saw somebody being insulted or treated unfairly, he was quick to do something about it. But I think in some ways the most important fight he led in Pittsburgh might have been, I think it was 1954, a ex-prize fighter with a rap sheet that went back about 20 years is arrested for killing a policeman. And a couple of nights later, he commits suicide in his jail cell on the Hill. Mal didn't believe that. The writers at the Courier didn't believe it. And it's a story where there are so many contradictions in the police account, which I think makes a lot of sense when we understand that from a present-day vision of what happens. But Mal was on the radio constantly, and he was the voice, the militant voice of the African American community, first on WHOD, then on WAMO. And that came with risks. I mean, sometimes he was driven around Pittsburgh in the trunk of a car. He's constantly being pulled over by cops and taunted, and he never budged.
Yeah, yeah. One of the stories that stuck out to me as a Pittsburgher who had a daughter who was a Girl Scout and went to Camp Conakry. As a Pittsburgher, I grew up hearing how the Reverend Dr. Leroy Patrick and a group of people integrated the Highland Park swimming pool. it never occurred to me that there were other places that needed to be integrated too, like Camp Quantiqui, where my daughter would go for camping. But yeah, he fought long and hard to get the Y to open up Camp Quantiqui so that African American children could go to that camp as well. That, yeah, just a little personal thing. One of the other things that surprised me, probably what surprised me the most, was that journalism was not like a lifelong dream of his. That he, like you said, he worked in the mill. He worked in the mill in high school and continued to work in the mill as a student here at the University of Pittsburgh. Then he got a job at the fancy men's store, Richmond Brothers. And he worked as a juvenile probation officer as well, and a manager of Bedford Dwellings when it was a new housing project. And even though he had a degree, even though he was an alpha man, his original plan to go to law school didn't come to be. So he had all those other jobs instead. But then something happened, and he was encouraged to go to the Courier for a job, but not as a journalist. You want to talk about how he ended up at the Courier?
He went to the Courier to kick up subscriptions and ads, and so he traveled to get more readership for the Courier. Mm-hmm. While there, his sister Mary D., who needs to be recognized more as well, who was the first African-American DJ in the nation, had a spiritual gospel station. And I don't even remember the exact how it was brokered, but he did a 15-minute segment called The Courier Speaks, in which he would reveal the news of the day. And this was very consistent with the legacy of black radio in this country as a place people would tune in to get their news and understand the culture and the period of the time, but all of this was under the radar of white America. So there, he really begins to develop gets his voice, literally, which was, by the way, spectacular. He had a beautiful voice. And from there, that is where his interest in journalism and in sort of the vehicle of telling the story emerges.
Mm-hmm. Now, throughout his life, he was an avid baseball fan. I think anybody in that era, my father was a baseball fan too. We went to Pirate games and a whole bit. But he became friends with Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson is the one that actually kicked the door open for him to be at ABC.
So Mal grows up on Hilltop in Homestead, which is where a number of skilled black steelworkers, a phenomena of that moment, which didn't last too long, lived in an integrated neighborhood. Across the street were the Vini brothers, who started the Homestead Grays. A block away is Cumberland Posey Jr., who will play for the Grays, manage, own. He's the only person in both baseball and basketball Hall of Fame today. When he starts doing radio, he brings Negro Leaguers after integration, players like Henry Aaron, Roberto Clemente, gives them a voice, gives them a way to be heard. And they became friends. Later on, every black and Latin player who would come to Pittsburgh from out of town would end up over at the Goode's house in Belmar Gardens for some of Mary Lavelle's cooking and Mal's mentorship. Among them was Clemente, Henry Aaron, who he takes to his first NAACP meeting, and Jackie Robinson, who sees him as a mentor, sees Mal as a mentor. And Mal is trying to break into TV. He gets a couple of gigs through Bob Prince, the former Pirate announcer, but he can't get hired by any of the local stations. Jackie understands that, and Jackie then speaks to the president of ABC News when he's on, I think, the Howard Cosell program, and says, I've been coming here and doing shows for you guys for a long time. I've seen 2 black people working here. One sweeps up, the other answers phones. And that led to him being hired.
Connections. Connections. And he was in his mid-50s when this happened. So he had had a life, a work life, before this big break. And he was hired, but he was given the United Nations beat. And as I understood it from your book, it sounds like a lofty beat, but there wasn't a whole lot of breaking news happening. So it was like, yeah, we hired him, we gave him a beat, but we're not going to hear from this guy. Until the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted. But even before then, he found a way to make himself known. He was a guy from Homestead who again, nobody, you are not better than anybody, and no one is better than you. So when he got to the UN, he introduced himself to everybody. Everybody, from the janitor to all the diplomats. So they all knew him, especially those of African nations. And this was at a time when the fight for independence in Africa was going on. And so he had contacts and was able to do stories about that with some sort of authority and trust by his contacts in there. So that's a big introduction, excuse me, to my question. The year before he got hired, 1961, Dan Rathers, CBS, got his big break covering Hurricane Carla. And the next year was the Cuban Missile Crisis. You write that there was a sea change in media going on at that time, too. Can you kind of talk to us about how Mr. Goode facilitated that and remade broadcast news as we know it today?
Yeah, it's such an interesting time because television news and broadcast news was sort of in startup mode when Mal Goode walked through the doors at ABC. They were adjusting to a new medium that was seeking national audiences, that would be communicating stories of local interest and local sensitivity to national audiences, and would be reliant on advertising dollars. So this was a new landscape and a new formula that they were trying to figure out, and it took a while. Television news came in fits and starts. But what we know for sure is that the model that they assumed was going to work, that wonderful print journalists would make wonderful television correspondents, did not work. It turned out to be a different skill set. We also say Mal Goode was built for television news. He was unflappable, he was ever prepared, which is why when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, he was ready to go on air, even though he didn't expect to go on air. In fact, we think that he was hired, but they weren't making a splash about putting him on the news. He was in a token role. He made ABC look better. But it was only his preparedness that got him ready to, what did we say, Rob? Something like 16 reports in 72 hours to deliver breaking news to the country. So Mal Goode, I would say, the other thing that's occurring here is that the civil rights movement is underway. And the civil rights movement, which is challenging the nation, is also challenging journalism and the news and what the question is of advocacy reporting and other notions of objectivity. Mal Goode wanted, more than anything, for the multi-ethnic, multiracial, pluralistic America to be characterized authentically, with respect and with dignity. I would also say that Mal Goode politely, professionally, and persistently pushed back against any characterization that was not accurate, And he never stopped carrying that mantle and opened up doors for others who were then able to force television news to turn the cameras on the people and understand the nation on which they were reporting in all of its complexities.
That is a great capsule of what you find in this book describing how that came about. Because even today, when I look at the news, I'm amazed at all the people of color that are on, not so much local news, but national news. National news. And I'm not just talking about black people. We have Asian people. We have people who's are probably first generation from Africa. And it's amazing, and it's just been a short period of time that we've seen that change. And he was definitely a leader in having that happen in network news. So, as I was reading this book is fascinating. I couldn't help but seeing parallels between post-Reconstruction and Jim Crow and today's rise in white nationalism, anti-Semitism in the post-Barack Obama presidency. The more things change, the more they stay the same. What do you imagine Mr. Goode, a self-described integrationist who was a friend of both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, what would he say or be doing if he was a correspondent today, do you think?
I think you suggest what he'd be doing. He'd be talking. He would be passionate, and he would be analytical. And I think he'd be indignant, and his blood pressure would probably be pretty sky high, like it is for many of us. Mm-hmm. One of the things I think that Mal Goode did really well was cross divisions in the black community. It's not only that he could speak to white people and Hispanic people and indigenous people as well as black people. He grows up in a black community which is fairly complex, with a lot of differences based on place of birth, level of education, occupation, and neighborhood, and Pittsburgh had that. But Mal could go from working a night shift with men who hadn't gotten out of high school at the mill to going to Pitt and being with alphas and being among an upper crust. And his entire life, he's able to stay rooted in the community in all its diversity, class-wise, as well.
Do you want to add?
Well, I was just thinking the other magical thing about Mal Goode is that when he was at ABC News, he became the mentor to a lot of young white journalists who were firebrand radicals. And he mentored, I'm thinking of David Snell, he mentored them, and he became a precious part of their lives on learning how to become a professional. And they would have long discussions, and David Snell would say, we would disagree, but we would have rich discussions about options and alternatives and strategies. So nothing was ever shut down by Mal Goode. I think he opened lines of communication.
He did. Okay, so when you started your research, did you know much about him?
Well, having spent time in 1991, a 3-hour interview that I then mined like crazy for a later book. And the more I learned about the history of Pittsburgh, I knew his world, but I didn't know the particulars. In fact, when I interviewed him in 1991 for Kings on the Hill, he didn't really speak much about ABC. It wasn't like he had to make me know about that, and I hadn't known about it at the time.
Okay. What about you, Liann? Did you know?
I did not. I knew it a bit through Rob's work, but the name was not familiar to me,
Okay.
which made the story all the more important to get out, and I was honored and privileged to be part of it.
Then I have to ask, how long did your research take?
In dog years, it took, well, there's a story there. It took us a good 8 years, I think, from start to finish when we began. And I would say the collaboration, I'm speaking for Rob now, it took a lot longer to do it because we were working on it together, and we both are full-time teachers. I'm a fuller-time teacher, and so we had a lot of Rob did another book along the way. We had a lot of other projects. But also, the more we got into it, the more it took us to get into it, the more we realized needed to be done. So 8 years.
Wow. And so I imagine your research took you out of Pittsburgh to get more information. Where did you have to go to?
I'll just keep going now. We went to Virginia, to both areas in which the enslaved histories were. That was lots of local research. We went to University of Missouri, which is where Mal Goode's papers are held at that prestigious school of journalism. And then most other things we could do. Did we go anywhere else? I feel like those were our two trips.
Teaneck?
Teaneck, New Jersey, which is where he was there for 30 years. And then we did the rest of our work in Pittsburgh, and spent a lot of time with the Goode family to get parts of the story that were not reproducible in those archives.
Sure. At what point did you say, okay, we have enough, let's start writing? And how long did the writing take?
I think we began writing early. I mean, because if you research something and then you wait a couple years to try to write it up, it's harder.
Okay.
But that also allowed us to do our obsessive editing. And you don't want to know how many drafts.
Yeah.
Well, that was going to be my next question. But okay, I understand. So did you write together, or did someone take one section and the other person took another section?
We kind of sectioned it, but in reality, because we passed it through each other so much, I look at parts and I can't remember, from which it came. We definitely worked it through. I would say it was a complete collaboration in all ways, which also added to the length of time it took, right? Because we had to have we had to battle some things out.
Of course.
Liann got her way all the time.
Of course. I was going to say it was like a marriage, but of course she got her way. But anyway, this is a 400-plus page book. 400-plus pages. And as I told them, I can't remember the last time I read a book that was 400 pages. I read, as you can maybe see from my little Post-it notes, I read the whole book. And though 400 pages under normal circumstances would be off-putting to me, and probably a lot of people, it was a good read. It was a smooth read. It was a fascinating read. Not a fast read, but a fascinating read. So who did you write this book for?
Can I? You mentioned Mary Goode, and I'd like to speak a moment about Mary Goode. So Mary Goode, Mal Goode's wife, was his equal partner in his vision for the family, for their faith, for education, for their children, and for this country in all ways. When you talk to people about Mary Goode, the stories always come out because Mal Goode would regularly, every phase of his life, call her with no notice and say, people are coming for dinner. And that number could be between 2 and 2 baseball teams, literally. And Mary Goode was always at the ready and was known for her amazing cooking and her fabulous food, and the baseball players and everybody went on and on about Mary Goode's cooking and her talent for her home. But in a deeper dive into Mary Goode, which was a complete passion project for me as well, was that Archimedes once said, "Give me a place to stand and a long lever, and I shall move the world," the ancient Greek mathematician. And to me, Mary Goode gave this community a place to stand. And then the connections that were built in that home, the comfort, the labor of the food, the way people were valued and comfortable and happy and felt fed in so many ways. And then Mal would go on and they would go into the corner and talk about the Negro problem. Mary Goode created the place to stand, and that lever was created from that place and those connections. So to me, I don't know where we started, but I ended up feeling that this was a book for this spectacular family who were living on a page in history. The children, the grandchildren, everyone, and I am just so grateful that we were able to capture it and deliver it.
You definitely captured it. I have one more question, but first, I want to, if I can find, oh yes. There was a story told that to me, excuse me, this is when I realized what grit and what his ability to speak truth to power. And if anybody has the book with you, it's on page 99. This was in December of 1934 when he was working at Richmond Brothers. And there was a big fancy to-do at the William Penn Hotel. And they were distributing checks for a half-week's salary as a bonus. So everybody goes up and gets their check and thanks folks and says thank you. But Mr. Goode, he got his check. Mal worked, reading from the book now, Mal worked 2 jobs and often lent his co-workers between pays. They applauded him when he was named. But I wanted everyone to understand something, so I said, I want to thank Richmond Brothers for this check, but you ought to know that it's the smallest check being given here. I'm the only Negro here, and I do everything but work with Louis Bruno, the tailor. I hope the day will come when I am paid in accordance to my ability and what I mean to this company. When somebody with the color of skin that I have can sell clothes in the store like Cohen and Fritzy and the salesmen here. Mr. Richmond, I'm saying this to you because you own the company and I think you ought to know. Now, a lot of people would be thinking that, but I don't know too many people who would actually say it to the person giving them the check. So, that was Mel Goode. Yes. My last question is, what do you want people to get from Mel Goode reporting?
I think that Mal and his family show what people can accomplish. They can overcome obstacles. They can do things that people didn't expect. And they could do it by sticking together, being people of deep faith, and feeling they were a part of a struggle for freedom. And I think probably almost more than any point in my lifetime, we want to tell that story, particularly to a younger generation.
Yes. Well, I thank you. I thank you for telling that story. I don't know if I turned off my mic or they turned it off for me. But I thank you both for telling that story, and you got to read the book. Maybe the movie will be made, and maybe there'll be another book about Mary Goode. Just saying, putting that out there. Okay? Sony, or whoever's going to be doing the Q&A?
I have a mic.
Okay.
There we go. I have a mic over here. If anyone has a question, just raise your hand.
Hi, I'm Valerie Thomas Njai, and I grew up in Homestead. And my grandmother, born in 1909, and I was her shadow, so my entire life, she talked about him, and I'm so glad I can appreciate him even more. And I knew him because I remember growing up at Clark Memorial Baptist Church. It was like Barack Obama had entered the sanctuary every time he did. And so for me as a child, I was always fascinated with the good. Now, there's a whole bunch of books out there that need to be written. One on her mother, Ruth White. It was like they were all magical. But I think what I always appreciated was the fact that they were part of the community. They weren't uppity. Now that you mentioned that his father instructed him, you're no better than, you're as good as. And so all the stories that I heard when I was around my grandmother and, you know, women who were born like in 1918, they always had these humorous stories about Mel and Mary and Goody and all of the others. And so they were just amazing individuals. And I thank you for writing this book. I can't wait to share it with so many people. And it was my daughter who told me about this lecture because she knows what Mel Goode and the Goods mean. And so when she heard about it, she's like, you got to be there. So I thank you. I cannot wait. I'll probably read that in 2 days. And I think some of it I already know.
Thank you.
This is his niece.
Surely I didn't ask all the questions you want to ask these two people.
Hi, I'm Bill Vanderveer. Can you talk a little more about his Pittsburgh connection? You said he spent a long time in Teaneck, New Jersey, but other than the baseball connections, what was his Pittsburgh life and his connection to this community?
He's born in Virginia and goes back and forth for a while as a kid. But by 1915 or 16, he's living full-time in Hilltop and Homestead, which is if you go over the bridge and you go straight up the hill, it's a section called Hilltop. He's got a couple of older brothers, a couple of younger siblings. He's very connected to different churches in Homestead. His dad is at the mill, and Mal goes to Homestead High School, starts working in the mill the summer before his senior year, and continues his senior year doing a night turn and going to school. Takes a year off to work full-time in the mill, and then goes to Pitt, combining work in the mill and being a student. And coming to Pitt and bringing him into Oakland means he's being exposed to a greater network of individuals in the black community. People who hang out at the Center Avenue Y, the Pittsburgh Courier across the street. He's understanding the importance of somebody like Daisy Lampkins and Robert Vann. And he doesn't want to work in the mills forever, but the Depression makes him happy to get any work at all. Eventually, he gets a job at Richmond Brothers, as Edwina pointed out, but then he gets a chance to be a junior probation officer on the Hill when his buddy Everett Utterback, who had been the first African American to captain an athletic team, track and field at Pitt, left his job there to go to a different position. And from being a junior probation officer, which means prowling the city, he begins to work as the boys director at the Center Avenue Y, which is a real hub of black Pittsburgh. And then he becomes a director of housing projects, then the Courier. So he knows everybody, and everybody knows him. You know, he's good buddies with Art Rooney. He's good buddies with the preachers. And then, of course, something happens he didn't think would happen, that at the age of 54, he gets a chance to break through on television.
I don't think I have much to add, but he was, when he went to TNEC for those 30 years, he was equally committed to challenging TNEC to be better as well. He was always involved.
I can go with that. Yeah, it's clear that the city of Pittsburgh was central to his formation and character. Can you tell us a little bit, as professional historians, what the process is? How do you drill down on the local history of Pittsburgh? Do you have a strategy for attacking that, or a process, or do you just find things and chase after them? Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Oh, well, that's you. He just wrote a book on the history of Pittsburgh, so.
It's pretty much chase after things and try to piece things together. I've always tried to stay out of archives. I don't like them. I like to talk to people. I like to listen to people. And that's how I've approached history. Asking a lot of questions of people who can contribute. Now, the further back you go, the more you have to use newspapers and diaries and things like that. But, I was lucky in that when I ended up in grad school, I ended up in the history department at Pitt, which was really in the vanguard of what was called the new social and labor history, which is looking at history from the bottom up, writing about sharecroppers and domestics and immigrants, not just people like Mellon and Frick and Carnegie. And there are tremendous colleagues and grad students and faculty who sort of helped me learn how to do that. And then you bring in Liann, who's got a million questions.
Hang tight. We're coming.
This is going to be dangerous.
Yeah, this is trouble. That was trouble too.
This question's going to be trouble.
This is a friendly question. I'm wondering how much ABC knew about who they were hiring. And I was thinking about all the caution that went into hiring Jackie Robinson, making sure he wasn't going to be a troublemaker, he was going to be able to take the taunts that he would get. And it seems to me that that's not who Mal Goode is. And did ABC know that? Did they look into his background when they took him on?
That's such a good question, Maggie. Thank you. We know, speaking of the historian's perspective, we don't know exactly how many people were auditioned for this job. We think that it was 13 or 14 or something around that. But I think part of what they liked about Mal Goode is that he was 54 years old. Mandatory retirement would have him out in 11 years. And they put him at the UN. But I was thinking that he would sort of be behind the scenes, and he didn't come with a strong journalistic platform. He was a pundit. He was a correspondent. He spoke. The other thing I was just flew out of my mind. What was that? About Mal is that he was hired, this is a secondary point, by Jim Haggerty, who was the president of the ABC News Division, who had been Eisenhower's press secretary for both terms. He's, to this day, is the only press secretary that lasted that long. He was very in tune with bringing pressers to the White House, was in tune with how the news looked, and also was in tune with the civil rights movement, and was apparently his major advisor behind the scenes when Little Rock occurred. And so we think that we don't have total proof of this, but we think Haggerty knew who Mal Goode was and thought that he would be a good fit in what ABC was trying to do, which had also just hired the first woman, Pauline Frederick, to be on the air as well. They were sort of, one thing we often you need to know about ABC News is that they were terrible in the rankings, that their big joke around where the correspondents were is that out of the top 3 networks, and only 3 networks, they ranked 4th consistently. So it sort of seemed that they would try anything, that they didn't have much to lose. They weren't losing place. And so with that, more risks were taken.
So my question is a little bit going back to the archives. Now I know, Rob, you said you don't enjoy the archival work, but I'm curious about Mr. Goode's archival materials and what you found in there, because as someone who researches some important people from the Black press who do not have archives, it's one of the most difficult things in terms of trying to even show their value to the history books because they don't have archival material.
The archives were robust. He saved everything. He was a fastidious letter writer, record keeper, pages and pages and pages, boxes. We railed through as quickly as we could come. He would write reports that weren't given. You know, he was, when I say always ready, we knew where he stood on everything. We found letters sent to Black athletes in the 80s and 90s, correcting their diction, saying things, some famous and infamous ones, in fact, saying things like, "You're educated, please sound educated." I mean, we always say, nobody too small or too big to receive Mal Goode's advice. And the other, I just have to tell this one quick story that, if we have 1 second, that didn't get into the book about how connected he was and the connections that he built, that he collected people, essentially. That was his hobby, and connecting them with each other. So a lot of the correspondence we get is him advocating for somebody to somebody else. So honestly, incredibly far-reaching. But one of my favorite stories was one David Snell told us when he started at ABC as a young correspondent who had just come out of Vietnam, who became more of a radical, and Mal took him under his wing. He was white, and he said he was so amazed. He said, "One thing I learned about Black people is they called each other all the time." And he said one day the phone rings and it's Ernie Banks, and he picks up the phone and he says, "Can I please talk to Mal Goode?" And he said, "Oh, sure." And David Snell says he's watching Mal Goode have a conversation with Ernie Banks, his hero. He cannot believe it, and he's listening, and another phone rings. So he says, "I better pick up this other phone," and he says, "Newsroom," and they say, "Is Mal Goode there?" And he says, "Mal Goode cannot talk. He's on the phone with Ernie Banks right now." And he said, "Oh, okay, well, when he's done, can you tell him Hank Aaron called?" So the stories that we couldn't even get them all in about this sort of vitality and these connections. So of course his archive reflected that. So there was more to do than we could do with. And here's my final story about the archive. Aren't you glad you said, "Do you want to take this one?" We found in the archive a thank you note from Rob Ruck to Mal Goode for the interview, and a copy of Mal Goode's letter back to Rob Ruck, acknowledging the thank you note. So that's when you know something has come full circle.
Well, I don't have a question. I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Stephanie White Phillips. I'm the daughter of his baby sister, Ruth Goode White. Oh. And I am 82 years old, blessed to be here. I'm the oldest living grandchild left. I'm 82, like I said. But I wanted to say that everything you have stated here this evening about my uncle is true. We were always raised in my grandmother's house that we were no better than anybody else, but there wasn't anybody else any better than we were. And we could go out in the world and do whatever we want. Now, my Uncle Mal was well known, but I had an Uncle Jim who was the oldest, born in 1905, and he was a realtor, had his own real estate company. I had an Uncle Bill who was born in 1907, who had his own pharmacy, which was open 24 hours around the clock. There were people on the hill, if they needed to get medicine in the middle of the night, they could come and go to my Uncle Bill's pharmacy. Then there was, of course, my Uncle Mal, born in 1908. Then came my Aunt Mary D. in 1912. She was the first She was the first black female disc jockey in the country, not just the city of Pittsburgh. And she lived until she passed away at 51 years old. She would have been 52 April 8th when she had passed away. Then there came my Uncle Bill. No, I'm sorry. Then there came my Uncle Allen, who we called what a lot of people say is the black sheep in the family. He liked things like the racetrack, the dog track. If the casino was open, Uncle Allen was there. But we loved him just the same. And then came my mother, last but not least, and she was the executive director of sickle cell for southwestern Pennsylvania. So I came from a family of somebodies, not nobodies. But we weren't taught to be disrespectful to anybody. No matter, my grandmother would feed somebody off the street. And I remember one instance growing up when the pastor to our church, Clark Memorial in Homestead, had come. He would always come on Sunday for dinner because he knew my grandmother was an excellent cook. But you know what my grandfather stood up and told him, even though he was the minister? He said, "You're welcome to whatever we have here at the table after my 6 children and my wife eat dinner first. Whatever's left, you're welcome to it." And that resonated with all of us. There were 17 grandchildren, and we have 10 of them left now. Yeah, we've lost 7 of them, but I'm just proud to be a part of the family.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you so very much. It is time. Thank you, Liann, for this wonderful book. Thank you, Edwina, for this conversation. Now it's time for us to get some books and to get them signed. If you have a copy of the book, the line will start here and wind down the hall. If you do not have a copy, we have copies for sale here for you to buy. Again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful night.